The man who once redrew the borders of Europe was, for a brief and highly unusual moment, outwitted by a group of rabbits. It's not metaphorical rabbits, not spies or enemies. Actual, soft-furred, long-eared rabbits who, in the summer of 1807, did not flee before Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, but instead charged him relentlessly, in waves. You've likely heard of the Battle of Austerlitz, it's perhaps the Treaty of Tilsit, but the rabbit hunt of 1807, less famous, less bloody, yet somehow more revealing. Let's start, as so many of Napoleon's campaigns did, with a plan. It was the summer after the treaties of Tilsit had been signed. The brutal wars of the Third Coalition had been paused, at least on paper. Napoleon was, at that moment, feeling very much like a man in control. And when emperors feel in control, they often begin to think about spectacles. In this case, a celebratory rabbit hunt. Now, you must understand, rabbit hunting was not a minor affair in Napoleonic France. It was a ritual for nobility and military. Elites, it wasn't about sport. It was about precision, poise, and posturing. You did not simply walk into a field and hope for the best. No, the animals were prepared. The grounds are carefully chosen, the attendees arranged. Most importantly, the rabbits were collected in advance, as collected. It was common at the time, especially among European aristocracy, to ensure that a hunt would not go awry by staging it. Hares and rabbits were purchased en masse and transported to the chosen field ahead of time. They would be released just before the guests arrive, not too early so they wouldn't burrow or escape, but not too late either, lest the delay cause undue waiting among the officers, whose boots were polished, whose sabers gleamed, and whose patience, as always, was thin. For this grand hunt, Napoleon's chief of staff had arranged something magnificent. According to accounts, between 300 and 3,000 rabbits had been procured for the occasion. Historians disagree on the exact number, largely because no one kept careful track once the situation began to escalate. The hunt was to take place on the grounds of a grand estate just outside Paris. Gentle hills, soft grass, slight breeze. The kind of day you'd describe as pleasant were it not for what happened next. Napoleon arrived in full dress, high boots, gloves, and a bicorn hat perched at a jaunty angle. Around him, a semicircle of generals, marshals, and aides-de-camp. These were men who had faced cavalry charges, sieges, and frostbite. Men who had seen Prussian lines crumble and Austrian artillery break on French resolve. They were not, however, prepared for rabbits. The handlers opened the cages. Now, if you're picturing a slow trickle of woodland creatures timidly hopping into the field paws, that is not what happened. Instead, the rabbits swarmed. It's not away, not to the edges of the field, toward Napoleon, directly, like a wave. The rabbits ran, not with fear, but with purpose. They came in waves, bounding over each other, their ears back, their noses twitching, a cascade of fur, a tide of fluff. One account describes it as a charging wall. Another, written by a military aide who would later serve in Spain, noted that the animals seemed unbothered by our shouts, and that His Majesty laughed at first, thinking it staged. But the laughter faded when the rabbits did not stop. They did not scatter. They climbed in boots, nibbled at uniform hems. One reached Napoleon's coat, and when aides tried to swat them away, they found themselves under siege as well.
Out there.
Our reports, though perhaps exaggerated, of grown men running, of boots being kicked off, of swords drawn against lagomorphs, Napoleon retreated in his carriage. So how did this happen? Historians with some amusement have pieced it together. The rabbits, it seems, had been purchased from local farmers, but not wild rabbits, domesticated ones. These were animals bred in cages, fed by hand. They did not fear humans. It's quite the opposite. They expected them to bring food. So when the cages opened, and a group of finely dressed men appeared with baskets and bags, the rabbits thought, lunch. To a rabbit raised in captivity, Napoleon Bonaparte did not look like a conqueror. He looked like a waiter, and so the hunt failed. No shots were fired. No game was bagged. The only thing wounded was pride. Napoleon, it is said, was amused at first, but amusement gave way to irritation. Not rage, he reserved that for battles and betrayals, but a quiet kind of frown. The kind of expression that said, I defeated Austria, crossed the Alps, I reorganized a continent, and now, rabbits. According to a later inventory, had been scuffed. One of them was scuffed. One of them was rumored to have a faint bite mark on the sole. It was never confirmed. The boots were quietly retired. For all his brilliance in military logistics, no one had briefed Napoleon on rabbit behavior. You might wonder, how was this incident recorded at all? After all, court historians were not known for including anecdotes that made emperors look silly. But soldiers? Aides? Secretaries? They talked, quietly around fires, in letters, in memoirs, and a few of those whispers have survived. Not in the official chronicles. You won't find it carved into triumphal arches. But if you dig through the personal writings of a few lesser-known staff officers, the story emerges, piece by piece, carrot by carrot. Now here's where the boredom of history becomes quietly meaningful. Because while this incident seems absurd, mere footnote, it reveals something essential. How uncontrollable even the most planned moments of power can be. How even the man who crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame Cathedral could not escape the unpredictability of nature. And how, in a summer field, the dynamics of war, politics, and pageantry could collapse into a swarm of hungry rabbits. So, what happened next? Did Napoleon laugh it off in private? Did he rebuke his staff? Did he ever attempt another hunt? Or did he simply return to the maps, to the treaties, to the corridors of commands, secretly wary of small, twitching noses? The morning after the rabbit hunt, there were no official decrees, no military tribunals, no apologies issued, but within the upper echelons of Napoleon's tightly managed empire, a kind of informal silence settled over the incident, as if by collective agreement. The generals and staff officers present would not speak of what had happened, at least not openly. Still, the absurdity of the moment lingered. You see, Napoleon's reign was not just built on military strategy or legal reforms. It was constructed, in part, through the careful curation of his image, the unstoppable general, the chosen son of destiny, the emperor of the people who held lightning in one hand and a codebook in the other. An emperor brought low by a rabbit swarm? It simply didn't fit the narrative. So the rabbit affair became what so many small, inconvenient embarrassments in history become, unofficially unspoken, but privately unforgettable. Let's take a moment to consider the people around Napoleon, the planners, the provisioners, and the men tasked with making everything he touched run smoothly. These were the quiet bureaucrats of the empire, many of whom had once worked under the Bourbon monarchy, then the Revolution, and now Bonaparte. The man responsible for organizing the hunt was Alexander Berthier, Napoleon's chief of staff. An efficient, precise, and famously humorless man, Berthier had orchestrated some of the largest troop movements in Europe. He had managed supply chains from the Rhine to the Alps. He had quite literally rewritten maps. But he had never dealt with rabbits. Berthier, by some accounts, had paid for the animals, personally ordering them from various local farmers to ensure an abundant supply for the hunt. The farmers, eager to please and eager to profit, sold him the most available stock, cage-raised rabbits, bred in close quarters and regularly fed by hand. It's important to note that at this time in France, rabbit breeding had become a small, but thriving rural enterprise. Especially after the food shortages of the 1790s, rabbits were inexpensive to feed, reproduced quickly, and required little land. As such, domesticated rabbits had become a kind of quiet lifeline for many peasant families. Their meat was tender, their pelts useful, and they didn't need vast pastures like sheep or goats. But domesticated rabbits behaved differently then. Wild ones. Berthier likely didn't know this. Or if he did, he didn't consider it relevant. After all, in the logistical mind of a military officer, a rabbit was a rabbit. They hop, they scatter. You aim, you shoot. But nature, even in its softest forms, is rarely that obedient. As the rabbits swarmed Napoleon, many of the officers tried to shoo them away. Some waved hats, or used the butts of unloaded muskets to nudge the advancing tide. A few drew sabers not to strike, but as a reflexive gesture of rank and absurd preparedness. One rabbit reportedly jumped into the open carriage beside Napoleon, where it began sniffing the seat cushions with great interest. Briefly at a saddlebag containing travel maps, a particularly bold specimen latched onto a coat hem and refused to let go, until gently pried off by a laughing lieutenant. None of the rabbits were harmed, but the same could not be said of Napoleon's dignity. Let's step back for a moment and consider why this matters. After all, this is a small incident. It didn't shift the balance of power in Europe, didn't change the trajectory of the Napoleonic Wars. It didn't end in bloodshed or revolution. It was, by any objective measure, a minor embarrassment. But in the grand project of empire building, the small moments often tell us more than the grand ones. Because the truth is, Napoleon needed control. Control over image, over narrative, over space and time itself. He was a man who once told his generals to march into the Egyptian desert carrying printed proclamations in Arabic even before they'd secured a translator. He commissioned paintings before battles were finished, dictated memoirs in exile with the same confidence. He had once dictated orders to marshals. In his world, nothing was left to chance, except perhaps for rabbits. In the weeks that followed the incident, no official mention was made of the failed hunt. But references began to appear in private letters, journals, and regimental correspondence. One aide, writing to a brother stationed in the Pyrenees, described it simply as a peculiar miscalculation of instinct. Another, more bluntly, wrote, "The Emperor has routed Austria, broken Prussia, and brought Russia to the table. But he could not outmaneuver a family of rabbits." Even in jest, these notes reveal something important. Napoleon was not untouchable. He could lose, not just on the battlefield, but in the pasture. Berthier, ever the professional, never acknowledged the event in his official reports. The farmers who provided the rabbits were not reprimanded, though some were never asked to supply again. And Napoleon? He never again participated in a rabbit hunt. Instead, he returned to Paris, resumed planning future campaigns, and immersed himself once more in the weightier matters of empire. But one wonders, did he think of them when sharpening his strategy for the Peninsular War, when staring into the fire at Fontainebleau, when hearing the rustle of straw underfoot in the imperial stables? Did he, perhaps, feel a tug at the edge? A memory of phantom nibble at his boot-tree minding him that once, in a quiet French field, 1,000 rabbits had refused to run. And what of the rabbits themselves? They are lost to history. No names, no graves, just shadows in the tall grass. Survivors of a moment so odd that historians debated whether it had even happened until the accounts added up. But for a brief moment, they triumphed, not through force, but by doing exactly what they had been taught to do: run toward food. What does this tell us then about power, about nature, about planning, perhaps even the best laid schemes weather? Of mice or of emperors can be undone by the simple expectations of creatures who, in their own small way, refuse to play their part. You may be wondering if this truly happened, if Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, was indeed mobbed by a wave of rabbits in the summer of 1807. Why have you never read about it in textbooks? Why wasn't it painted like the dramatic crossing of the Alps, or immortalized in bronze, like his stance at Austerlitz? The answer, as it often is in history, lies in what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. The event itself, though absurd, was real. It is documented not in official French state records, but in scattered offhand mentions across private memoirs and letters. Napoleon's own valet hinted at it in his later years. A few battlefield aides, writing home during calmer seasons, described it as a comic defeat or a very small disaster. And yet, despite being retold in these whispered margins of history, it never made it into the formal story of Napoleon's reign, because the story of empire is built on triumph, not on trousers nibbled by rodents. But let's step back. Let's look at 1807, not just the rabbit incident, but the broader world it existed in. Because in order to understand why this matters, we have to understand what Napoleon was trying to be. That summer, he was at the height of his power. Third coalition had collapsed. The Treaty of Tilsit, signed just weeks before, was Napoleon's crowning diplomatic victory. He had sat face-to-face with Tsar Alexander I of Russia on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, like two gods dividing the earth. Prussia was humbled. Kara was silent. Britain stood alone, a thorn across the channel. And Napoleon, the self-made emperor from Corsica, now ruled over a realm that spanned from the Iberian Peninsula to the gates of Warsaw. He was no longer simply a general. He was a symbol of modernity, of power, of inevitability. His image, carefully crafted, showed him as rational, logical, and always in control. And so this rabbit incident, this harmless, fuzzy rebellion, stood out like a thread out of place in a military tapestry. Because the truth is, control is never absolute, not even for emperors. History tends to remember the big moments. Cannon fired, the coronations, the revolutions. But much of life and power is composed of small embarrassments, quiet miscalculations, and lessons unspoken. That is why the rabbit hunt matters. It reminds us that leadership, no matter how grand, exists within the fragility of everyday reality. It doesn't matter how many treaties you sign if a group of rabbits sees you as lunch. It doesn't matter how many armies you command if nature, even in its gentlest form, refuses to cooperate. And that's not just funny, it's humanizing. As Napoleon's empire expanded in the years that followed, this tiny episode remained. Tucked in the memories of a few scattered witnesses, officers who would later fight in Spain, secretaries who would later pen memoirs in exile, valets who watched their master command men like chess pieces but lose two bunnies in a field. Napoleon was eventually exiled to Elba in 1814. He was given a small household, a few guards, and a much reduced lifestyle. According to some accounts, though, these must be taken with a grain of salt he took to gardening. And, allegedly, he asked for a rabbit hutch. No one knows whether this was ironic, nostalgic, or simply practical. Rabbits were, after all, steady source of meat. But part of you has to wonder, is it a joke he never let go of? A quiet grin at his own expense? Or a test of whether fate would once again send him a herd of hopping rebels? Napoleon's second reign, his 100 days came and went quickly. Then Waterloo. Then St. Helena, the remote Atlantic rock where he would live out his final years in exile. There, surrounded by wind, boredom, and books, he dictated his legacy. He spoke of glory, of Europe, of justice and genius. But not, as far as we know, of rabbits. And yet they remain, not in paintings, not in statues, but in the folklore of footnotes, in the chuckling margins of memoirs. There's something strangely comforting about it, don't you think? That the man who once commanded the greatest army on earth was, for one afternoon, defeated not by enemy troops but by animals no larger than a loaf of bread. It reminds us that no matter how grand the stage, absurdity has its place. That every empire, no matter how sweeping, has its moment of quiet, ridiculous surrender. So the next time you see an official portrait of Napoleon standing stiffly in uniform, staring out with that iconic imperial confidence, just imagine, quietly, the soft rustle of fur at his feet. Imagine the twitch of noses, the subtle scuff on a boot, the emperor. Surrounded, and consider, in the grand sweep of history, what do we actually remember? And what do we choose to forget? Imagine yourself walking through a thicket of early morning fog. The ground is still damp from a night's quiet drizzle, and the air carries that deep green smell of soil and wood. You push past a cluster of hazel branches and see them, simple, squat wooden hives lined up like little houses, their tops sloped with thatch. A low hum pulses in the silence, like a living breath rising from the earth. This is not a battlefield, not a castle or cathedral, but it is a center of quiet, crucial labor, a medieval apiary. And here, surrounded by trees and bramble, in a clearing the world forgot, lives a beekeeper. Not a knight, not a king, but a figure just as vital. In the Middle Ages, honey was more than sweetness. It was currency, medicine, preservation, symbolism. And beekeepers, those odd, semi-monastic figures who worked at the edges of society, held the delicate thread between survival and spoilage. Today you may think of beekeeping as a hobby, wooden boxes and neat backyard rows. But in the 11th or 12th century, it was closer to a sacred duty. Beekeepers were known for their patience, their secrets, and their occasional peculiarities. Some were lay brothers in monasteries. Others were peasants granted forest rights by noble lords. A few were even women quietly tending their hives while weaving baskets or dyeing cloth. What united them was not status, but a shared rhythm, the gentle cycle of the bee. Let us place ourselves in Bavaria around the year 1143, though this could just as easily be Yorkshire or Normandy or Bohemia. The beekeeper's name is Wolfram. Wolfram is not a wealthy man. His cottage has a thatched roof and a smoky hearth. He owns 2 coarse tunics, a pair of wooden shoes, and a goat named Ilga, who eats his laundry if he turns his back too long. But what Wolfram does, have what he guards like a reliquar, his 12 skep hives, woven from rye straw and daubed with mud, each one home to a humming kingdom. You may be unfamiliar with skeps. They're not the wooden boxes of modern beekeeping. Instead, they resemble upside-down baskets. Bees enter through a small opening near. The base and the interior is shaped by the bees themselves, combs layered in careful arcs, each cell mathematically perfect. Once filled, Wolfram harvests the honey by killing the hive. Yes, that is one of the harsher truths of medieval beekeeping. Unlike modern techniques, where hives can be inspected and reused year after year, skeps were often destroyed to extract honey and wax. Combs would be crushed, and the bees smothered by smoke or buried in pits. Still, some keepers like Wolfram learnt gentler methods, dividing swarms, luring new queens. These men were seen as a little odd, a little too close to the insects, a little too patient for their own good. But their work was essential. We see sugarcane was rare in Europe before the 15th century. Expensive, imported, a luxury beyond reach for most. Honey, then, was the only sweetener available to common folk. It flavored ale, preserved fruits, coated nuts, and glazed meats. It also healed. Beeswax was used in candles and salves. Honey itself was smeared over wounds, believed to purify infection. Monks mixed it into herbal draughts, believing its golden clarity reflected divine order. So Wolfram's work, though quiet and solitary, supported a network of need from market stalls to sick beds to altars. Each morning before the dew dried, Wolfram would visit his hives. He carried no gloves, no netting, only a thin veil, which he rarely used. He would hum to the bees, soft and low, not words, but sound. This, he believed, helped them know he meant no harm, and perhaps it did. Medieval beekeeping was as much myth as method. One widely held belief was that bees responded to song and scent. It was said that angry hives could be soothed by whistling, and that bees would follow a keeper who wore rosemary on his wrists. More importantly, there was a custom known as telling the bees. Whenever something important happened in Wolfram's life, birth, death, marriage, he would walk to the hives and speak to them, not metaphorically. Literally, he would bow slightly, tip his cap, and whisper, "My brother has died. I will tend the hives alone now, or there is a new calf born. The child will have milk in winter." It was believed that if bees were not kept informed of the household's affairs, they would become distressed. They might stop making honey. They might leave entirely. Some keepers went further, dressing the hives in black cloth during mourning, or placing breadcrumbs on the skep as a funeral offering. Wolfram believed in all of it, and why wouldn't he? The bees, after all, were not merely insects. They were witnesses, spirits even. Their hum was the sound of nature speaking in code. In late summer, Wolfram would begin his harvest. He selected hives by weight and sound. A heavy hum meant a strong colony, a light one, perhaps illness. He used smoke to calm them, created by burning damp herbs, sage, thyme, and mugwort. The smoke didn't hurt the bees, it distracted them, dulled their stingers, and made them slow. Would then remove the hive from its base and turn it over. Using a curved knife, he sliced the wax comb free, catching the sticky mess in a clay basin. Any live bees were shaken gently back into the fields or collected for another skep. This was labor-intensive, hot, sticky, sometimes dangerous. Wolf had been stung many times over the years. Once, his hand had swollen so badly he couldn't hold a spoon for a week. Still, he worked in rhythm, humming, whispering, cutting the combs with reverence. Honey would be strained through linen, then stored in earthen pots sealed with wax. These pots were sold in the village market or traded with the monastery for barley, soap, and salt. The wax was even more valuable. Let's pause here to talk about beeswax. In the medieval world, candles were not ornamental. They were essential. And they came in two types: tallow, made from animal fat, cheap, smoky, and foul-smelling in beeswax, clean, bright, and expensive. Beeswax candles were reserved for churches, noble homes, and those who could afford purity. They burnt longer, smelt faintly sweet, and their glow was considered divine. Monasteries, especially, prized wax for their endless cycle of liturgy. Some even kept their own apiaries, while others relied on men like Wolfram. Thus, in his own quiet way, Wolfram supported the prayers of an entire abbey, not through speech, but through flame. In early autumn, when the bloom had gone from the meadows and the hive mouths began to quiet, Wolfram would prepare for winter. He insulated his skeps with straw and dung. He stacked firewood. He thanked the bees. There was a ceremony for this, a small one. He would place a piece of bread dipped in honey on a stone beside the apiary. Then he would whisper, "Sleep well, wake hungry." Some called it superstition, called it courtesy, and so the months passed in rhythm. Bloom and swarm, smoke and honey, the soft hum rising, then fading. Wolfram grew old, but the bees did not mind. They changed queens, they changed seasons, but they always returned. And he, always patient, kept listening. But here's the question: why were beekeepers so often described as solitary, odd, or even enchanted in medieval records? Why did villagers leave them small gifts, or ask them to bless newborns with honey? Was it fear? Was it reverence? Or was it something deeper? Recognition that those who listened to bees might be listening to something else as well. Assume that a man like Napoleon Bonaparte, so thoroughly etched into the pages of textbooks and seared into our collective memory as a military genius, wouldn't have the time or interest for a picnic. And yet on one gentle July afternoon in 1807, as the treaties were being inked and the burdens of warfare momentarily lifted, he did just that. It was not a grand military banquet or formal state celebration. It was a relatively modest countryside, gathering a gesture of celebration following the signing of the treaties of Tilsit. Napoleon, flush with victory, ordered an outdoor feast to reward his generals and inner circle. And with that decision came one of history's strangest footnotes, the infamous rabbit hunt. As you sit there now, calm and adrift in thought, consider the texture of that moment, a warm afternoon sun hanging lazily in the sky over the French countryside. Clouds casting shadows that wandered slowly over the field. The soldiers, aides, and staff were perhaps a little less formal than usual. Some loosening their coats, others basking in the rare moment of levity. The scent of bread, cured meats, and rich cheeses would have mingled with the waft of summer, flowers and trampled grass. Napoleon, by all accounts, was in good spirits. He just signed a treaty that reshaped Europe. The Russians were now allies. Prussia had been subdued, and the British had been pushed back to the periphery. For now, he had time to breathe. So why not a rabbit hunt? To execute this idea, Napoleon's chief of staff, Alexander Berthier-Evre, the detail-orientated officer, arranged for the hunt to take place on a large field near the imperial encampment. But here's where the events took a strange turn. Rather than relying on the uncertainty of wild game, Berthier ordered that hundreds, possibly even thousands of tame rabbits be procured and released for the hunt. You might already sense the problem here. Wild rabbits, with their twitchy instincts and fearful nature, are elusive. They dart, vanish, and hide at the first sign of movement. Tame rabbits, by contrast, are accustomed to humans. They do not run away. Some of them, in fact, may even approach if they associate humans with food. So imagine the moment. And his party arrive, armed not for war, but with hunting gear, perhaps laughing and ready for some sport? The gates of the enclosures are opened, but instead of rabbits fleeing in all directions and darting into bushes, they begin hopping directly toward the emperor and his men. At first, it must have been amusing. Rabbits hopping forward. Cute, perhaps. Odd, but manageable. But then more. Came and more. And soon the field was overrun with hundreds of rabbits bounding and bouncing not away but forward toward the men, toward the carriages. And most concerningly, toward Napoleon himself. Contemporary reports say they swarmed. His boots tugged at the hems of coats, leapt onto laps, and clambered over anything in their path with desperate enthusiasm. Here, the atmosphere began to change. What had started as a light-hearted gesture of celebration transformed into something farcical. Soldiers were swatting away rabbits. Officers were tripping over them. Aides de camp tried to shoo them, only to be followed relentlessly. Some accounts even claim that Napoleon retreated to his carriage, still pursued by the fluffy mob. It is important, though, not to laugh too hard or to sensationalize. Its history, as you know, is full of absurdities that are often sanitized or omitted. From official retellings, the rabbit incident was embarrassing. Certainly, but it also revealed something about the fragile boundaries between power and parody. For a moment, the man who had dominated Europe, orchestrated coups, and appended monarchies, was rendered comically vulnerable not by a rival general or a cunning assassin, but by a horde of domestic rabbits. And this wasn't simply a case of a few animals behaving oddly. There are credible claims from multiple sources that Berter, in his zeal to create an enjoyable hunt, had secured as many as 3,000 rabbits for the occasion. Many were sourced from farms, raised in cages, and well accustomed. 2. Humans. When the cages opened, the rabbits did not scatter as wild ones might. Instead, they sought food and safety the way they always had, by approaching people. The emperor, you'll recall, had a particular distaste for looking foolish in public. And so, rather than laughing it off or engaging in self-deprecation, he was said to be furious. More so, perhaps, than after some battlefield losses. He reprimanded Berder and the organizers, not for poor hunting arrangements, but for a perceived insult to his image. Some said Napoleon never mentioned the rabbit incident again. Others believe he used it as a metaphor later in life, citing it as an example of how the smallest, most ridiculous events could unravel even the most careful planning. Still, you have to wonder what the others thought. Did the marshals whisper and chuckle later in the camp? Did Berder lose sleep that night, imagining himself remembered not for his campaigns or logistics brilliance, but for commanding the world's fluffiest ambush? And what of the rabbits? Did they feast happily on table scraps, or were they rounded? Up once again, and ushered away, their job as unwitting symbols of absurdity complete. There is something deliciously mundane in all of this, isn't there? That at the height of empire, with Europe reshaped and generals at his side, Napoleon Bonaparte found himself scrambling away from a tide of rabbits, his boots nibbled, his dignity tested not by cannon fire, but by tiny twitching noses. Yet the question lingers. Why was it so important to Napoleon that everything, even leisure, be staged, controlled, and choreographed? As dusk crept in on that faded July evening, long shadows spilt across the grass. The sun, golden and low, cast its farewell glow on a countryside, still littered with signs of a most unusual skirmish. Overturned crates, bits of carrot tops and clover, paw prints trailing through soft soil, and here and there, tufts of fur left behind in the wake of history's oddest stampede. The rabbits by then had either been rounded up or simply wandered, off into the surrounding hedgerows, unaware that they had just shaken the dignity of the French Empire to its foundations, at least in spirit. In the annals of Napoleonic history, the great victories Austerlitz, Marengo, and Jena stood, tall and proud. This, however, this fluffy affair, would find its home elsewhere. not in the battlefield chronicles, but in quiet footnotes, whispered rumors, and the occasional mischievous anecdote passed from aide to scribe. Back at his quarters, Napoleon was said to be sullen. He may have paced. Perhaps he ranted. Certainly he would not have laughed. For Napoleon, image was more than vanity, it was weapon and armor. Every appearance, every uniform, every pose in a painting was calculated. He understood the value of myth. The emperor was not just a man, he was a symbol, a living embodiment of ambition, order, and strength. That afternoon, surrounded by giggling officers and nipping rabbits, the myth had frayed. And that, to Napoleon, may have been intolerable. Berthier, ever loyal and ever terrified of his master's displeasure, likely tried to explain. He'd ordered the best rabbits. The farmers had promised they would run. No one expected such a reaction. Still, the damage was done. It's easy to forget how human even the most iconic figures of history really were. See them in statues. And oil portraits, frozen in marble and paint, stripped of their doubts, embarrassments, and insecurities. But every now and then, a crack forms. Through that crack, a little absurdity leaks in just enough to remind us that they too had bad days, strange moments, and, in this case, a full-scale bunny incursion. The incident might have faded into oblivion entirely were it not for the persistence of those around him. See, Napoleon was not merely a man of war, he was surrounded by men of words, secretaries, generals, diarists, and foreign diplomats. They all took note, even if they didn't dare speak openly of it. The rabbit story appeared in whispers. A line in a letter here, a chuckle in a memoir there. Even later accounts, some skeptical, some Gadir friends the event with a kind of delighted disbelief. British writers especially took a certain pleasure in recounting the tale. After all, what better way to deflate the menace of a man who had once threatened to invade their island than to imagine him running from rabbits? Over time, historians began to sift through the legend. Was it 300 rabbits or 3,000? Were they really tame? Did Napoleon really flee to his carriage and retreat? The truth, as is often the case in history, may be a blend of facts and exaggerations. Perhaps it wasn't quite a stampede, but a disorganized hop. Maybe Napoleon wasn't panicked, but merely annoyed. And yet, the very possibility of it all is what delights us, because this is the kind of history that doesn't roar at giggles. And yet, it raises deeper questions too. For all his brilliance, Napoleon was a man obsessed with control. He orchestrated governments, drafted law codes, and redrew maps. In war, he calculated the movement of troops like pieces on a chessboard. Even his personal mythos was curated, from the lowly Corsican outsider rising through the ranks to the crowned emperor immortalized in David's paintings. So perhaps this rabbit incident disturbed him not just because it was embarrassing, but because it revealed something uncomfortable, that there were forces in the world, however small or ridiculous, that he could not command. Imagine being Napoleon. In that moment, not just a man in boots, but an empire made flesh. And then flap. A rabbit brushes against your leg. And another and another. You try to wave them off, but they're persistent. More come, they're not listening, they don't care who you are. No battalion will save you from rabbits with no respect for rank. There's a strange kind of beauty in that. A reminder that no matter how towering the myths we build, no matter how fearsome the titles or vast the armies, even emperors are sometimes chased by bunnies. And after all, what is power if not constantly vulnerable to the absurd? The world continued, of course. Napoleon would return to war, to governing, to his dreams of reshaping Europe. The treaties would be honored, then broken. Campaigns would rise and fall. History, relentless and sprawling, marched on. But somewhere in the quieter corners of memory, this peculiar day endured. Among all the laurels and losses, this one momentum commanded. Uncontrolled remained, preserved like a dried leaf in a massive tome. A tale told not with brass or drums, but with twitching whiskers and soft paws. And now here you are, lulled by the gentle cadence of history's oddities, letting your thoughts drift over grassy fields and rustling fur, letting the stories of long ago brush against your imagination like so many quiet-footed rabbits, Sleep, like history, approaches. Not with a roar, but with a whisper. The year was 1868, and London smelt faintly of smoke, horses, and damp stone. Streets bustled with top hats and parasols, the clatter of wheels against cobblestones blending with the distant toll of church bells. Fog often rolled in like a soft, gray tide, cloaking everything in mystery, even the mail. Letters in Victorian England were lifeblood. They carried secrets, sentiments, contracts, instructions, and flirtations. The post was, quite literally, a system on which the empire depended, and it was growing busier by the day. With Queen Victoria firmly on the throne and industrial marvels popping up like mushrooms after rain, the General Post Office found itself besieged. More people were reading, more were writing. Trains sped the mail between cities and in towns. Nimble-footed postboys delivered bundles several times a day. It was, by all accounts, a marvel of precision and endurance. But within the walls of certain sorting offices, especially in the great London headquarters there, lurked a quieter helper, not clad in red coats or brass buttons, but in sleek fur, not bearing sacks of letters, but bearing a hunter's patience. These were the postal cats. It's truly. While seldom celebrated in grand histories, the employment of cats by the British postal system was as real as ink and wax. They did not sort letters or carry telegrams, but their job was crucial. They were mousers, quiet, tireless, often unnamed, and always alert. You see, the sorting rooms of Victorian post offices were a paradise for rodents. Stacks of paper, bits of string, scattered crumbs from a tired clerk's lunch, and most inviting of all, warmth, shelter, and an abundance of nooks in which to nest. Rats and mice could chew through important documents. They could cause miniature disasters half in birth certificates, shredded telegrams, even gnawed-up parcels headed for the colonies. To combat this, the Postal Service turned to an ancient ally. And so one by one the cats came. There are records, blessedly bureaucratic records, mentioning them. A letter from the Post Office Secretary's office dated May 1869 speaks of 2 cats being officially employed in the London office, with a modest budget allocated for their upkeep, a few shillings a week for food. It's not a bad deal, all things considered. One might imagine the first day on the job, a tabby stepping through the wide stone threshold of the General Post Office on St. Martin's Le Grand. Tail aloft, whiskers twitching. No formal training, no uniform. Just instinct and opportunity. The clerks, of course, had their doubts. But soon enough, results spoke louder than skepticism. It wasn't long before letters were arriving intact more often. Tiny bite marks and suspicious droppings vanished from the scene. And in the quieter hours of the night shift, some swore they saw little green eyes glinting under the gaslights, stalking the shadows between desks. These cats, unlike today's pampered house pets, were part employee, part resident. They had jobs to do, and they did them with a quiet dignity only cats can manage. They did not purr for praise, nor linger for affection.
Oh.
Their reward was the hunt hand, perhaps a bowl of milk. But let's not romanticize too swiftly. Their lives weren't entirely cushioned. The post office, for all its prestige, was still a working environment, noisy, drafty, and bustling with feet. Not all employees were fond of feline colleagues, and yet by and large they were tolerated and, in time, even respected. By 1873, the London office had formally acknowledged the cat's value. Their food allowance was increased. Reports were filed on their effectiveness. And in other post offices from Liverpool, 2 Leeds managers began requesting their own cats. One such report clipped from a local paper and tucked into an internal memo praised a mouser named Blackie, who'd caught over 24 mice in her first month at the South London branch. Another cat, affectionately nicknamed Mrs. Sniffles, was said to patrol the telegraph room with near military discipline, accepting strokes from no one but the senior clerk. There's something quietly charming about it all. In an age of great mechanical advancements, siren bridges, steam engines, telegraphs, the solution to a very modern problem turned out to be something very old. And these cats, invisible to most historians, padded their way through decades of postal history. They were there when love letters crossed oceans, They were there when dispatches from India and Canada piled in dusty corners. They sat on warm radiators, occasionally sprawled across sorting tables, occasionally vanishing into rafters. They were not heroes, not revolutionaries. They simply kept the chaos in check, one mouse at a time. And while their names were rarely recorded, they left behind a subtle legacy. A line in a memo, a paw print on a blotter, the soft scrape of claws on polished stone floors. History, as it turns out, isn't always made by men in wigs or ladies in silk gowns. Sometimes it's made by a twitch of whiskers in the right place at the right time. If you were to wander into the British Postal Museum's archives and, if you were the sort of person who peers into forgotten drawers, you might stumble across something peculiar. It's not a grand painting or a dusty map, but rather a simple logbook. Faded leather, worn spine, and scrawled across the top. Feline allowances, 1873 to 1909. Yes, a ledger. For cats, and inside, names, occasional descriptions, small notes in looping penmanship. It reads like a mix between a bookkeeping journal and a pet diary. An entry from 1875 reads, "Cat stationed at Eastern District Office name, unknown. Weekly allowance increased from 1 south, 6D, to 2 south, on account of superior mouse-catching record." There were others, Ginger, Captain Meow, and the somewhat officious Reginald. Some notes indicate illness as fleas, a limp, or an unfortunate scuffle with a parcel cart. Others mention replacements being brought in. It seemed was steady. Among these cats, one name appeared more than any other, Tibbles. Now, Tibbles was not an uncommon name for a Victorian cat somewhat like Buddy or Mittens today. But this Tibbles, appearing in records from 1882 to 1890, had something of a reputation. Not just as a mouser, but as a minor celebrity. According to clerk's notes, Tibbles served at the Southwest London sorting office, a building known for its drafty corridors and its particularly bad rodent problem. Before Tibbles reports indicate damage to over 300 letters in one fiscal year. Not a scandal precisely, but enough to warrant a firm rebuke from the Postmaster General. And so, Tibbles arrived. No one's quite sure who brought him in. A porter's niece, perhaps? A station master with a soft heart. But once there, he stayed. A slender ginger Tom with striking amber eyes and a white-tipped tail. By all accounts, he was as aloof as a prince and twice as shrewd. His methods were efficient. He rarely missed. One clerk wrote in a personal journal, "Tibbles has cleared the third-floor dispatch room entirely. Not a nibble on the mailbags in 3 weeks. He saunters like a lion and naps like a bishop." Some evenings, as the gas lamps flickered and the sound of pigeon wings echoed against the iron rafters, Tibbles could be seen perched atop the parcel scales, one paw draped over the edge, surveying his kingdom. In time, he was given an unofficial title, Chief Mouser of the Southwest District. Someone even made him a tiny medal, fashioned from a spare brass button and a bit of ribbon. It was never pinned to him, of course. That would have been beneath his dignity. But Tibbles' fame extended beyond the post office. A local newspaper caught wind of the story and published a whimsical piece titled "A Cat of His Majesty's." Post children brought him scraps. Nearby shopkeepers claimed he crossed the street like a gentleman. One tea merchant reportedly offered him salmon on Fridays. When he passed quietly in his sleep in the summer of 1890, the staff pooled money to bury him in the small garden behind the office. They placed a stone there, modest but lovingly etched. Tibbles Faithful, servant of the post, 1882 to 1890. And though the building was demolished decades later, some say the stone was salvaged. Perhaps it lies in a private collection. Or perhaps it's still there, tucked beneath a patch of London moss, forgotten by all but the roots. Tibbles' story, charming as it is, speaks to something broader. The odd little human tendency to find companionship in quiet corners. In a time when stiff collars and strict manners ruled the day, the presence of a purring creature among the clerks softened the air. More cats followed. A black and white cat named Whiskey worked the late shift at Bristol. Lady Muse, an elegant, long hair with a temperament as sharp as her claws, presided over the Newcastle telegraph room. There were rumors of a feral who patrolled the Edinburgh Post Depot but could never be caught or named, only glimpsed, like a ghost by tired postman. At dusk, and over the years, the post office continued its modest feline employment program. It's not officially enshrined in policy, but quietly accepted. A small budget line, a bowl by the radiator, a knowing nod between employees. Even in Parliament, someone once raised the issue, half in jest, half with curiosity. A member of the House of Commons, reading from a prepared card, asked the Postmaster General whether the feline members of staff are, in fact, receiving appropriate rations. The response, recorded and Hansard, was dryly amusing. "I am happy to assure the honorable gentleman that our cats are adequately nourished and continue to perform their duties with exemplary dedication." What a line to be etched in the archives of empire. In an age of grand imperial adventures, global telegram lines, and steam-powered revolutions, the quiet work of small paws remained out of sight, but not without meaning. These cats were, in their own way, part of the system. Their stories may never be taught in classrooms or enshrined in textbooks, but in the smudged margins of bureaucracy, they thrived. They were there when lovers quarreled by post, when fortunes changed with the stroke of a pen, when news of births, deaths, and distant wars rattled across the empire. They watched it all, and perhaps late at night. When the letters had all been sorted and the building hummed with silence, they dreamed not of greatness, but of warm corners, vanquished mice, and the soft rustle of envelopes falling like autumn leaves. Early 20th century, the world was changing fast, so was the post. Automobiles were rumbling into city streets. The telegraph had peaked and was beginning its slow fade into novelty. Trains ran faster, deliveries became standardized. Letters now zipped across the country on schedule, stuffed into steel mailbags, and locked behind sliding doors. Efficiency had become an art hand. Every inch of the system was optimized, from the size of the envelopes to the glue used on the stamps. But amidst this whirlwind of modernization, the postal cats remained. Quieter now, less celebrated. Their names appeared more sparsely in the ledgers. The charming notator Robin caused minor chaos grew rarer. Their lives continued, but unnoticed. It's almost like the creak of an old floorboard beneath a layer of new tile. One final tale from this fading chapter deserves its telling. In the winter of 1909, a clerk named Edwin Porter took overnight shifts at the Northern Railway Mail Depot in Manchester. He was a quiet man, recently widowed, with little to occupy his time beyond the soft shuffle of mail and the repetitive thunk of sorting. He arrived early, left late, and drank his tea with condensed milk from a dented tin. It was there, in the far back corner of the depot's central sorting room, that he first met Cat No. 23. The cat had no name. Not in the ledger, at least. Just number 23 Gray Tabby. Left hind limb. Stationed North Depot. Weekly allowance 1 south. She had apparently been there for years. Longer than most staff. Certainly longer than the new electric sorting belts. She was a silent companion, weaving between crates and mail sacks, keeping mostly to herself. Porter took a liking to her. He would leave her a small saucer of dripping or a slice of ham, began calling her Miss Penny, though he never said it aloud in front of others. In his diary, found decades later in a Manchester attic, Porter wrote, "There is something watchful about her, as if she is older than the depot. She knows when a telegram carries. Bad news. I swear she avoids the letter carts bearing telegrams from the War Office." Of course, it was superstition. But old buildings and late nights often give rise to strange thoughts. Miss Penny, or Cat No. 23 continued her quiet service for months, perhaps years. No one seemed to remember when she'd arrived. She simply had always been there. On rainy nights, she curled behind the stove. During winter strikes, she sat beside picketing postmen, tail flicking in rhythm with their chants. And then, one February morning in 1912, she was gone. No fanfare, no signs of illness. Her bowl remained half full. Porter searched the depot, checked the roof, asked the cleaners. No one had seen her. A few clerks joked she'd finally boarded one of the mail trains, heading for warmer pastures. One man said she'd been taken in by a kind widow in Salford, but most like Porter knew the truth. She had simply disappeared into the same shadows from which she came. Porter's last diary entry about her reads, "Miss Penny did not return tonight. The air feels colder without her. I've placed her saucer back on the shelf. She was never really ours to begin with." Shortly after, the Northern Railway Depot underwent renovations. Then came the war. Then came more war. The post changed. Had to. By the mid-20th century, cats were no longer officially employed by the Royal Mail. Budgets tightened. Pest control was outsourced. New hygiene standards made it difficult to keep animals in sorting offices. The last ledger entry for a postal. Cat is dated 1952. Cat at Dalston Junction, no longer required. Funds redirected to maintenance budget. And just like that, a 90-year tradition vanished. But they weren't forgotten. Not entirely. In the 1980s, a retired postmaster in Kent wrote an op-ed titled Mice, Moggies, and Mailbags, recounting his childhood memory of a tortoiseshell cat named Marmalade, who used to nap atop letter sacks. Local newspapers printed small tributes to the last cat of Leeds Parcel Depot. A few museums tucked photos into display. Cases grainy images of clerks standing beside cats perched on scales or curled near the base of tall shelves. And in 1996, when the British Postal Museum opened a new wing, one small display quietly featured Tibble's ledger, open to his final entry. A brass bowl was placed beside it, empty but polished. Visitors pass it without much notice. Most stop for the vintage uniforms, the pillar boxes, and the pneumatic post tubes. Some perhaps older folk, or those who've known the comfort of animals in cold places, pause. They smile, they nod. Because history isn't always about kings or wars or revolutions. Sometimes it's about the small things. Paw print in the dust. A forgotten ration note. Pair of eyes in the shadows of a dim depot hallway. The postal. Cats may be gone, but their memory lingers. In the margins, in the corners of logbooks, in quiet warmth. And somewhere, if you believe such things, the ghosts of those whiskered workers still curl up behind radiators, watching over mailbags and sleeping soundly beneath the hum of midnight trains. Long before electric refrigerators quietly hummed, in kitchens, before frozen pizzas, supermarket freezers, or even the humble ice tray, there was a time when ice itself was a luxury. Not in the sense of a cold drink on a hot day, though, that too was part of it. Rather, ice was a substance, of status. A thing pulled from winter's deepest chill, carved with care, wrapped like treasure, and shipped hundreds of any thousands of miles to those who could afford its fleeting coolness. And behind this curious demand was a remarkable and often forgotten profession, the ice harvester. To understand their strange world, one must go back to the 18th century, 2 frozen lakes and frosted beards, 2 sawdust-lined ice houses and transatlantic ambitions. It began, as many peculiar things do, with wealthy households trying to impress each other. In the drawing rooms of Boston, the salons of Paris, and the aristocratic tea tables of London, offering chilled desserts or serving wine with tiny glistening chips of ice became the height of refinement. Guests would marvel not just at the taste, but at the miracle of it. How, they would wonder, had the host managed to summon the cold of January into the heat of July. It was a question of logistics and labor. And enormous blocks of frozen water. The most common source? It's frozen ponds and lakes. Across New England, Scandinavia, the Alps, and even parts of Russia, entire communities turned to the business of ice. Come winter, when the water had frozen at least 8 to 12 inches deep, men would march out with special saws, chisels, and iron tongs. They worked quickly and rhythmically, slicing the surface into a checkerboard of neat cubical slabs, each weighing anywhere from 200 to 400 pounds. It was grueling work. The air is bitter, the wind sharp, and the tools heavy. Ice dust caked into their mittens and lined their eyelashes like salt. One slip, and a man could tumble into the water where the cold bit quick and the risk of death was real. But to the men of the trade, this wasn't hardship. It was livelihood. Many of them were farmers in the warm seasons. Ice harvesting was a way to earn money during the slow months. Horses were fitted with special cramp-on shoes, pulling sleds groaning with ice across the snow. Teenagers and old men alike would drag sledges onto the banks, sliding the blocks into deep storage pits known as ice houses structures, often built half underground, heavily insulated with sawdust, hay, or straw. The magic of these places was not their technology, but their simplicity. Well-packed ice covered properly could last not just for weeks, but for months. In a properly designed ice house harvested in January, ice could survive until August or even later. These were not warehouses of chill, they were vaults of time. And then came the transport. In the early 1800s, ships began carrying ice across oceans. The idea seemed absurd at first. Surely skeptics claimed ice would melt before reaching its destination. Enter Frederick Tudor, a name rarely known today, but once called the Ice King. In 1806, Tudor, then just 23 years old, shipped 130 tons of ice from Boston to the Caribbean island of Martinique. Locals thought he was mad. Customs officials weren't sure how to tax a block of frozen water. The ice arrived somewhat reduced, but intact, and it sold out instantly. Doctors, barkeeps, and plantation owners, they all wanted more. Thus began a global obsession. By mid-century, American ice was being shipped to Calcutta. Norwegian ice traveled to London. Indian Maharajas stocked their palaces with Arctic cold. Ice became commerce, a silent, glittering export. A luxury good wrapped in burlap and coated in sawdust. But behind the grandeur and globe-trotting glamour remained the harvesters, anonymous men on frozen lakes. Hacking with iron bars, soaking, wet and red-fingered, eating boiled potatoes from tin buckets while the wind howled across the ice. Their stories rarely made headlines. Their names seldom appeared in the records. But without them, the empire of ice would have never existed. They were the quiet, stoic sculptors of winter, and their season was short but magical. Each year, they waited for the perfect week when the ice was thick but not yet snow-covered. When the weather promised clear skies and steady cold, children skipped school to help. Entire towns paused to assist. There was laughter and shouting and songs sung through scarves. There's a journal entry from a Vermont harvester in 1794 that reads, "We cut for 4 days, no sleep but 4. Spells. My boots froze to my legs. But the sun came through the mist on the 3rd morning, and the lake glistened like 1,000 panes of glass. We were rich in nothing but cold, and we were happy." That's how the ice harvest began. But as we'll see in the next section, the story only grows stranger from tropical markets to icebox tycoons, from sabotage and lawsuits to the moment when frozen water became one of the most fought-over resources of the modern world. By the mid-19th century, the once humble act of cutting ice from a lake had become an international enterprise, spanning oceans, crossing empires, and powering a global trade network few could have predicted. At the heart of this revolution was Frederick Tudor, the self-made ice king of Boston, who turned a simple idea into a transoceanic phenomenon. By the 1830s, his ice was reaching as far as Cuba, Brazil, India, and even Australia, thanks to his careful refinement of both transportation techniques and insulation science. He learned to pack ice in ship holes with compressed sawdust, creating a low-cost, natural insulator that could reduce melting dramatically. This wasn't just preservation, it was alchemy. Tudor was transporting winter through summer, across deserts and jungles, and into the hands of the elite. In places like Calcutta, his product became the toast of colonial society. British officers stationed in the sweltering Raj could enjoy a chilled brandy or a cool fruit desert, all thanks to ice hauled from Boston's freshwater ponds. The irony wasn't lost on observers. Here was New England frost melting in the mouth of a British general beneath the Indian sun. The profits were enormous. Tudor became one of the wealthiest men in New England. But where there is ice, there is competition, and soon other merchants, inventors, and engineers wanted in. Norwegian exporters started sending ice to England via the North Sea. Scottish barons opened inland ice houses. Russian oligarchs developed their own lakeside harvesting operations. And in warmer parts of the world, clever entrepreneurs built artificial ice houses lined with straw, brick, and underground chambers. Designed to receive the product and store it for months, soon the ice wars had begun. These weren't wars of soldiers or sabers, but of routes, patents, and price cuts. Merchants in Boston slashed prices to edge out Norway and Caribbean markets. London buyers turned to cheaper Russian ice for their fish markets. Even in Havana, bribery and sabotage crept into the game. Ice shipments were delayed at ports. Rival barrels were broken, and even false rumors of disease in American ice were spread. And yet, the public, especially in cities, clamored for more. By the 1850s, ice wasn't just for the rich anymore. It flowed into urban meat lockers, fish stalls, dairy carts, and most significantly, the homes of the rising middle class. It allowed milk to stay fresh, meat to keep longer, and beer to be served crisp. It changed how food was prepared, how meals were timed, and how people lived. This transformation was especially dramatic in cities like New York, where ice wagons became a daily sight. Children would chase them barefoot through the streets, hoping to snag a fallen chip of ice on a hot July day. These wagons delivered massive blocks, sometimes over 100 pounds, to homes, equipped with ice boxes, primitive but effective wooden cupboards lined with zinc or tin and cooled by a slowly melting block. And just like that, cold became part of domestic life. The presence of an icebox was not just practical, it was aspirational. Families measured their status by whether they could afford weekly ice deliveries. Whole routines were shaped around it, checking the melt tray, chipping ice. For lemonade and keeping butter firm in the summer, the Iceman's arrival became a moment of the day, as reliable as the post or milk. There's a remarkable account from an 1858 diary of a seamstress in Philadelphia. Mrs. Garrett across the hall had ice today. She served pears that were cooled and glistening. Her guests praised her for being modern. I saved 2 pennies for Saturday in hopes I can buy a chip to chill water before my evening walk. But the rise of ice also had unintended consequences. Natural ice was not always clean. Harvesters worked on lakes often shared with animals, runoff, or even sewage. Once insulated with sawdust, ice could carry debris, bacteria, or worse. By the 1860s, as urban disease outbreaks like cholera gripped cities, some physicians began to warn against contaminated ice. It was a dilemma. People wanted cold food and drink, but at what risk? This led to a strange new kind of rivalry: natural versus artificial ice. Inventors and chemists had been experimenting with mechanical refrigeration since the 1830s, using ammonia and other chemicals to cool air and water. By the 1870s, ice machines began appearing in breweries, meatpacking, plants, and hospitals. Unlike lake ice, this man-made version was produced in controlled conditions, sanitary, uniform, and increasingly cheap. The traditional ice harvesters scoffed at first. Machine ice? They laughed. That's not real ice. It's manufactured. Nonsense. But the writing was on the frosted wall. In 1879, New Orleans hosted one of the first major ice riots. Traditional ice sellers fearing job loss attacked a local ice plant, breaking its equipment and threatening its engineers. Police intervened. No one was killed, but the message was clear. The frozen frontier was becoming a battlefield. Even Frederick Tudor's legacy began to fade. The man who had pioneered global ice shipping died in 1864, just as refrigeration began to rise. Within 2 decades, entire harbors that once bustled with ice ships were quiet. But not all was lost. For a while, the two systems coexisted: mechanical. Ice worked best in factories and urban centers. Natural ice still ruled rural areas and countries without reliable infrastructure. Some clever businessmen even blended the two, storing machine-made ice in traditional ice houses, or using lake ice to power early refrigerator units. It was an uneasy truce. One era was fading and another emerging, but in the quiet in-between, Ice remained a strange, glimmering bridge between worlds. It connected village lakes to tropical islands. It turned farmers into industrialists, changed diets, customs, and even language. Ever wonder why we still say icebox instead of refrigerator? In all of it, every chilled peach, every preserved fish, every cocktail cooled in the heat of summer, traced back to men who stood in snowdrifts with iron hooks, pulling frozen slabs from still, quiet lakes. In our final section, we'll explore how the Ice Age finally ended and why the echoes of this cold empire still linger in today's world in slang, architecture, climate debates, and even in the humble ice cube tray in your freezer. At the dawn of the 20th century, the once glorious global ice trade was beginning to melt away, not with a thunderous collapse, but a slow, inevitable drip. The rise of artificial refrigeration had shifted the balance. No longer was civilization bound to the whims of winter. Ice could now be summoned, produced on demand with compressors, coolants, and coils. It was a quieter revolution, but no less profound. Gone were the armies of ice cutters who trudged through snow with their horses and plows. Gone were the lakefront shanty towns that sprang up each winter to house workers. And gone, too, was the mystique, the idea that ice was a seasonal gift, to be hoarded, revered, and transported halfway across the earth. Now, it was simply cold, commodified. But the legacy of the old ice trade was far from forgotten. In fact, many of the technologies and systems developed during that era would directly shape the modern cold chain, the global system of refrigerated transport and storage that underpins much of the modern world. To understand this, we must follow the ice not just where it came from, but where it went. Ice as infrastructure during the height of the natural ice trade. Cities had already begun to reconfigure themselves around cold. Ice boxes became standard in urban homes. Restaurants restructured their menus to include chilled dishes. Hospitals and mortuaries demanded consistent refrigeration. Dairy producers and butchers built storage cellars lined with zinc and cooled by giant blocks. When mechanical refrigeration took over, these systems didn't disappear, they evolved. Cold became an assumption, not a luxury. Railroads were outfitted with refrigerated cars, enabling the first truly national food systems. Now, Midwestern beef could be shipped to New York diners. Florida oranges could appear in Boston in February. Milk could be preserved for longer. Vaccines could be shipped across continents. Fruit could ripen mid-ocean. Perishability was no longer an unbreakable law of nature. Instead, it became a matter of engineering. The global cold chain we know today, keeping everything from strawberries to insulin, fresh across thousands of miles, owes its origin to the ice harvesting industry. Even now, the term cold chain reflects that lineage. Some historians refer to it as one of the most invisible revolutions in human history. Without refrigeration, our diets would shrink dramatically. Our cities would revert to more local economies. Our medicine cabinets would empty. Our vaccines, our lab samples, even our data centers all rely on artificial cold. Direct descendant of those 18th and 19th century harvesters, the forgotten ice houses of empire, as the ice faded from everyday consciousness, its architectural remnants quietly lingered. In India, enormous British-built ice houses still stand in cities like Chennai and Mumbai massive. Domed brick buildings with thick walls, designed to store New England lake ice beneath the tropical sun. In London, Victorian-era ice wells, stone-lined. Shafts that plunge deep into the ground still lie hidden beneath cobblestone streets and apartment buildings. Some have been converted into museums. Others are sealed and forgotten. The American Northeast, the ruins of lakeside ice houses remain, covered in ivy and moss, their beams creaking under the weight of time. Local legends often surround them. Tales of men who froze to death in storms or mysterious footprints on snow-laden roofs. And on farms across Scandinavia and the Alps, you can still find underground ice cellars, once filled with carefully stacked blocks, still cool even in summer, thanks to clever ventilation and insulation designs passed down through generations. They are the cold cathedrals of a forgotten industry. The romance of ice even as technology progressed. The image of natural ice never lost its charm. By the 1920s, Advertisements for new electric refrigerators still featured imagery of alpine glaciers or frost-dusted ice cubes glistening in crystal glasses. There was something comforting, almost magical about cold in the heat of summer. Writers and poets took notice. In Edith Wharton's novels, a well-iced pitcher of lemonade was a mark of class. In F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, ice-cold drinks shimmered like jewels during sweltering parties. Even today, an icy gaze or a frosty reception draws on that same symbolism. Ice became shorthand for elegance, control, and luxury. Cocktail culture revived its importance. Bartenders began carving crystal-clear blocks, importing ice molds from Japan, and learning the chemistry of dilution. Ice, once hacked from a frozen pond with brute force, became a sculpted art form in trendy bars from Brooklyn to Berlin. And at the same time, environmental historians began to study the energy cost of cold. After all, refrigeration is among the most power-hungry systems in the world. The industrial cold chain, responsible for cooling our food and medicine, also contributes significantly to carbon emissions and climate change. We are now at a strange moment where the pursuit of cold one's a marvel has become both a necessity and a burden. The echo in your freezer, so what remains of the old ice world, perhaps more than you realize. Each time you crack open your freezer, reach for an ice cube, or cool your drink on a hot afternoon, you're participating in a legacy centuries in the making. The Iceman may no longer clang down your street. The lake may no longer freeze the way it once did. But the systems, routines, and even language shaped by those chilly winters still linger in daily life. And if you happen to stumble upon an old stone structure in the woods, half-sunken and moss-covered, with strange iron hooks, embedded in the floor, and a shaft that seems to descend forever, pause, you may have found one of the last ice houses, a monument not to war or royalty or conquest, but to cold, to the men who harvested it, to the ships that carried it, to the empires it touched, and to the idea that something as ephemeral as frozen water could shape the course of history. In the still mornings of a medieval spring, before the crows began their cawing and the bells summoned sleepy monks to prayer, one could often hear a softer sound, the faint hum of bees. It was not a sound feared or avoided, but one welcomed like an old psalm. For in the villages and monasteries scattered across medieval Europe, bees were far more than just insects. They were divine collaborators, economic allies, and mystical creatures whispering ancient truths in a language only the truly devoted dared to interpret. This is the story of medieval beekeepers, not the apiarists of modern science, clad in mesh and wielding smoke butt of barefoot monks, forest hermits, peasant women, and silent friars who lived closely with their bees in a time when nature was holy and honey was gold. It is a story of reverence, superstition, songs, saints, and waxen candles that lit up cathedrals and crowned emperors. Honey before sugar to begin, we must understand that in the Middle Ages, honey was not simply sweet, it was the only sweetness available to most people. Refined sugar was a rare luxury, imported at enormous cost from distant lands like India or the Eastern Mediterranean. For most Europeans, especially those outside the elite circles, honey was the sole sweetener used in cooking, brewing, preserving, and healing. Honey was used in ale and mead-fermented honey drinks popular long before beer reigned bread, and porridges, medicinal ointments and balms, throat soothers and wound dressings, embalming fluids and burial rituals, and even as a preservative for fruits and meats. The demand was constant and year-round, which meant that beekeepers held a quiet power, especially those who could keep their hives healthy through cold winters and strange diseases. But honey wasn't the only valuable byproduct. Beeswax, odorless and slow-burning, was in even greater demand. In an age before gas or electricity, wax candles were the only reliable source of clean light. Unlike tallow animal fat candles, which smoked and stank, wax candles burnt with a pure flame and were thus considered worthy of holy spaces. Cathedrals needed thousands, monasteries too, even royal courts and wealthy merchants commissioned beeswax candles for banquets, ceremonies, and writing by candlelight. So while the medieval beekeeper might appear as a humble figure stooped in a field, covered in veils or herbs, speaking softly to their hives. They were in fact crucial players in a high-stakes economy of light and sweetness. Monks, mystics, and the buzz of the divine, it is no coincidence that some of the most advanced medieval beekeeping took place in monasteries. Monks, with their devotion to order, patience, and the rhythms of nature, were ideally suited to tending bees. Many monasteries maintained large apiaries, rows of straw skeps, early beehives shaped like domes, nestled against warm stone walls or tucked in gardens near the herb plots. To these men of the cloth, bees were not just useful, they were spiritual. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux once referred to bees as the wisest of creatures. In medieval sermons, bees were often described as symbols of chastity, industriousness, and divine order. Their queen, once thought male and later discovered to be female, was imagined as a just and holy ruler. Their hives were little kingdoms of harmony and cooperation, microcosms of the heavenly city. Some monks wrote entire treatises on bees, blending observation with theology. The 13th century Dominican friar Thomas of Cantimper, in his encyclopedic work De Natura Rerum, declared that bees collected not just nectar, but virtue from flowers. It was believed that bees were drawn to piety. Stories circulated of bees swarming around the heads of saints or nesting peacefully near relics. One tale, a hive moved into the sleeve of a sleeping monk and did not sting him once. Interpreting his purity as divine protection, hive songs and honeyed superstitions outside the monasteries. In the tangled lanes of villages and the forest clearings of serfs and herbalists, bees were both beloved and feared. There existed a tradition known as telling the bees. When a member of the household died, the beekeeper would approach each hive and whisper the news to the bees. If they were not told, it was feared they might leave the hive or stop producing honey altogether. Similarly, when a wedding took place, the bees were told. When a child was born, they were told. In some parts of Europe, hives were even dressed in mourning cloths after a death. In parts of England and Germany, there were elaborate bee songs verses, sung or chanted when moving a hive or collecting honey, designed to calm the bees and invite good fortune. They sounded almost like lullabies or psalms, mingling folklore with deep affection. Bees, bees, come home. Your queen is calling. The flowers are gone. Sleep in your hive and dream of bloom wake with the spring and banish gloom. Some believed bees could smell sin. Dishonest beekeeper might find their hive suddenly empty. Others claimed bees could detect bad luck and would sting those fated to die soon. To keep hives healthy, beekeepers used incantations, rubbed hive entrances with garlic or holy water, and recited prayers to St. Ambrose, the patron saint of beekeepers, who, according to legend, had bees rest on his lips when he was a child, an omen of his future eloquence. The hidden world of hivecraft, unlike today's square wooden boxes. Medieval hives were most often skeps woven baskets made from straw or wicker, shaped like small domes or inverted bells. They offered warmth in winter and could be easily lifted for harvesting. But harvesting from skeps was no easy matter. Without removable frames, a medieval beekeeper had to destroy part of the hive to collect honey or wax. It was a delicate, dangerous, and often sorrowful process, sometimes involving the killing of bees. This was not done lightly. Many keepers fasted beforehand. Some said prayers. Others sought omens in the buzzing. Was it low and steady or high and agitated? Some believed the hive itself would whisper whether it was ready. Tools were rudimentary smoke, pots to lull the bees, curved knives to cut comb, and hollow horns to funnel honey into clay jars. The work was done at dawn or dusk, when bees were calm and light was soft, and always the keepers moved slowly. Some wore veils of linen, others trusted in calm hearts and sacred charms. A few whispered apologies as they harvested, murmuring gratitude in the old tongue. This was the hidden world of medieval beekeeping, a fusion of labor, lore, prayer, and peril. It was a world where every drop of honey was sacred, where every flicker of candlelight carried the echo of wings, and where the line between insect and angel blurred, if only for a season. The next section, we'll explore how honey became medicine, how royal courts hoarded bees like treasure, and how wars were waged not only for land and gold but also for wax. In the musty corners of medieval infirmaries, where poultices mingled with prayers and leeches slithered in bowls of water, honey was a staple remedy. To the medieval mind, it was more than just a sweetener, it was a healing gift from heaven, capable of drawing out infection, soothing the fevered, and even preserving the dead. And in this section of our tale, we venture deeper into the herbal gardens and candlelit courts, into the dusty manuscripts of monk physicians, and into the strange and sticky politics of bees. Honey as medicine long before microscopes and sterilisers, honey was one of the few substances medieval healers trusted completely, and for good reason, even without modern knowledge of its antibacterial properties. Honey's preservation abilities were well observed. Hippocrates recommended it for wounds and sore throats. Galen, the Roman physician whose teachings dominated the medieval curriculum, prescribed honeyed ointments for everything from indigestion to eye disease. But the medieval apothecary didn't stop at those traditions. Instead, they alchemized. They mixed honey with crushed herbs like sage, thyme, and chamomile, vinegars and oils, ground stones and powdered pearls, and occasionally stranger ingredient sashes of animals, gold leaf, or bits of parchment with holy inscriptions. Honey was believed to balance humors, the mysterious bodily fluids that governed medieval health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much melancholy? Spoonful of warm honey? A cold stomach? Honey with pepper? Fat liver. Honey with rose water. Some manuscripts recommend honey enemas for the truly brave. Others suggest it as a daily morning tonic, a spoonful before dawn, to awaken the mind and gladden the blood. In monasteries, where medicine mingled with miracle, honey was often administered with a prayer to Saint Modwena or Saint Hildegard, both associated with healing and nature. Monks kept herbals illustrated books with recipes and remedies, many of which survive today, sticky with centuries-old notes in the margins. For swelling of the throat apply honey and fig. Do not eat after sunset. Do not anger bees. The apothecaries of the hive beyond honey. The beehive yielded a veritable apothecary's shelf of ingredients. Beeswax was not only candle material, was used in balms to seal wounds and burns, and mixed with goose fat or resin to soothe chapped skin or dry eyes. Propolis, the sticky resin bees used to seal hive cracks, was scraped and applied as an antiseptic on cuts and sores. Royal jelly, the substance used to feed larvae and queens, was considered a rare elixir, though access was limited and its properties largely mysterious. In royal courts, these substances became commodities of influence. Kings and nobles sent envoys to monasteries or rural estates to acquire medicinal honey. Beekeepers became quiet diplomats, offering their rarest jars dark with herbs, thick, and glistening with careful language and bowed heads. Some honey came with certificates of origin, stamped with monastic seals. The more sacred the source, the higher the value. Honey from bees who fed on the flowers around saints' relics was considered especially potent, capable of healing not just the body but the soul. The wax wars: if honey healed, wax ruled. Medieval Europe. In an age when darkness began at sunset, wax provided light, clean, long-lasting, sacred light. Cathedrals consumed tons of it. Royal coronations were illuminated by tapestries of flame. Even contracts were sealed with wax, pressed with rings, or official seals. This made beekeeping not just an agrarian task, but a matter of politics. Feudal lords often demanded wax as a form of tax from their serfs and tenants. A small village might owe several pounds of wax annually to its baron, who in turn owed it to the crown. Some manorial records detail wax quotas alongside grain and eggs. Certain forests and meadows were declared hivelands territories, where wild hives could be claimed, protected, and farmed. Poaching honey or wax was a serious crime in some regions, akin to stealing a lord's cattle. In some Germanic and Slavic regions, beekeepers formed guilds, early prototypes of cooperative organizations. They had codes of conduct, secret methods for hive management, and fierce territorial pride. Some even built bee towers, multi-level wooden hive structures tended by specialized keepers known as Zeckmeister. Wars occasionally included raids on monastic bee yards or rural apiaries. During the 100 Years' War, records exist of French raiders seizing barrels of wax from English abbeys. It wasn't just about wealth, it was about control of light. Candlelit crowns and PayPal flames, perhaps. The most powerful demonstration of wax's value was its presence in coronations and PayPal rituals. At the coronation of a king, beeswax candles were essential. It's not just any candles, but those purified, and shaped by monksiphone, inscribed with psalms or symbols. Their flames were believed to be witnesses before God, illuminating oaths and alliances. The Pope's liturgies, too, demanded beeswax candles. The Easter Vigil, one of the most sacred nights in the Christian calendar, began with the lighting of the Paschal Candler, tall, thick beeswax candles symbolizing Christ's resurrection. Only beeswax was permitted. Tallow was considered unclean. This elevated the role of beekeepers once more. Behind every coronation, every Easter vigil, and every illuminated gospel manuscript, there was someone in a field, tending to bees, collecting. Wax one careful scrape at a time. It was a silent empire of candles, rooted not in swords or scrolls, but in the tiny architecture of hives. Honey and the afterlife in some cultures, honey was used in funerary rites. The ancient Egyptians embalmed their dead with honey. That tradition whispered into parts of medieval Europe, where honey was occasionally used to preserve bodies before burial especially if transport was delayed. Legends tell of noble bodies shipped bathed in honey across rivers or sea. In folklore, it was said that a drop of honey placed on the tongue of the dying would sweeten their final words, or help them enter heaven with gentleness. Others believed bees could guide souls. Some placed beeswax figures beside graves. Others released bees near cemeteries, murmuring prayers as they flew. In Lithuania, pagan traditions surrounding bees merged with Christian ones. Their bees were believed to carry messages between the worlds of the living and the dead. Even into the 16th century, people would approach hives and whisper the names of the departed, hoping the bees would carry them skyward. The deeper one travels into the honeycombs of the past, the more astonishing it becomes. Bees were not just insects. They were pharmacists, currency clerks, and custodians of memory. And the medieval beekeeper, quiet, careful, listening, always stood at the center of it all. In our final section, we'll explore the lives of famous medieval beekeepers, the poetic metaphors of bees in medieval literature, and the long decline of the sacred hive as industry crept in. By the late medieval period, as plows turned more land and trade routes bustled with foreign goods, the old world of the beekeeper began to shift. But before the sacred hush of the hive was replaced by industry's clamor, it had one last golden age of time when bees were sung of in monastic verses. Saints were said to speak their language, and when entire villages paused to witness. A swarm. This final chapter explores the forgotten wisdom of medieval beekeepers, the strange cultural echoes bees left behind, and how their sacred standing slowly faded, as quietly as a queen leaving her hive. The saints and the bees, several saints, were believed to have special connections with bees, their lives woven with miracles and buzzing devotion. Saint Gabnet, the patron saint of beekeepers in Ireland, is perhaps the most famous. According to legend, Gabnet fled from danger and was guided by a divine vision to settle where 9 white deer grazed at Ballyverney in County Cork. There she founded a convent and tended bees. When raiders approached her community, she prayed. The bees swarmed the invaders, stinging them into retreat. To this day, locals still leave flowers at her shrine on St. Gabnet's Day, February 11th, and carve tiny hives on stones in her honor. In Wales, St. Modymnoch, sometimes called St. Dominic of the Bees, was believed to have brought the first bees to Ireland in his cloak. He had tended hives at a monastery, and upon returning home, the bees followed him. 3 times he tried to leave them behind, and 3 times they followed until it was clear he had been chosen as their shepherd. Even St. Ambrose, the patron saint of Milan, was associated with bees. Legend says that as a baby, a swarm flew into his cradle and covered his mouth, then vanished. His father took it as a sign the child would grow into a great speaker. Fittingly, Ambrose became known for his eloquence, and beeswax candles became a staple in churches bearing his name. Bees in literature and symbolism in monastic scriptoria, where manuscripts were copied and illuminated. Their hives were seen as holy communities, mirroring the ideal monastery: diligent, disciplined, and harmonious. The 9th century treatise De Institutione Locali described the perfect Christian kingdom as one modeled after a beehive, the king as the queen, bee gender notwithstanding. The clergy as worker bees, and the soldiers as drones. Each had a role, each sacrificed for the whole. Medieval poets took inspiration as well. Geoffrey Chaucer, in the Canterbury Tales, refers obliquely to bees in the Parson's Tale, likening the organized life of monks to the buzz and order of the hive. In French courtly poetry, lovers compared sweet kisses to honeyed gifts and sang of maidens whose voice stung like a bee but soothed like wax. Even beekeeping manuals read like spiritual texts. One 13th century guide advises, "Approach thy hives as thou would a chapel, humbly, clean, and silent." Beekeepers as mystics and mediators, it's here we find one of the strangest and most touching aspects of medieval beekeeping: the belief that bees were sentient, moral creatures with souls attuned to human joy and sorrow. Beekeepers were expected to speak to their bees. This tradition, known as telling the bees, was rooted in ancient folk belief, but survived well into the medieval and early modern periods. If a beekeeper died, someone would approach the hives and whisper the news. If a marriage occurred, the bees would be informed. If a child was born, or if someone left for war, the bees were told, often with bits of black cloth tied to the hive, or a spoonful of honey offered in reverence. Failing to tell the bees was believed to bring misfortune or even cause the hives to die. Some historians believe this ritual reflected a deep psychological bond between humans and bees. After all, a hive was a mystery to most. Dark, alive, humming with purpose. To tend it was to enter a rhythm not entirely human. To speak to it felt like addressing the divine. Decline of the sacred. Hive by the 14th and 15th centuries, subtle changes crept in. As towns expanded and market economies matured, beekeeping became more commercial. Honey and wax, once sacred offerings, were increasingly measured, taxed, and traded like any other good. The Black Death decimated entire communities, including monasteries where beekeeping knowledge was carefully passed down. So too did their herbals, hive designs, and sacred rituals. Wars like the 100 Years' War and the Crusades disrupted rural life and destroyed countless apiaries. Forests were felled for timber and agriculture, removing wildflower habitats, and hollow trees that supported wild hives. New sweeteners also emerged, first imported sugarcane and later refined sugar. By the late Middle Ages, sugar became the fashionable choice of the elite, and honey fell in prestige, relegated to rural folk remedies and religious use. Worse, innovations in hive designs such as the skep, a domed straw hive, led to destructive harvests. Beekeepers would often kill the colony at season's end to extract wax and honey. In earlier centuries, this was avoided. Now it was efficient. Spiritual language around bees faded. No longer were they the companions of saints or messengers of God. They were livestock, profitable but silent. Echoes in the present yet. The old songs never fully vanished. In isolated valleys of the Pyrenees, some still whisper to their hives. In the forests of Poland and Lithuania, tree beekeeping carving hives into trunks. Now, just as medieval foresters did has seen a revival, scholars pore over medieval manuscripts, studying how climate and crops shaped bee life centuries ago. Artists recreate bee motifs from illuminated books. Monasteries in Ireland and France have returned to sacred apiculture, blending ancient hymns with modern conservation. And in our own time, as bees face collapse from pesticides, disease, and habitat loss, the medieval view of bees as holy, vital and more than insects, suddenly feels prescient. Because somewhere in the dark hush of a hive is a reminder that order and sweetness can emerge from chaos. Those small things, working together, shape the world. That a whisper to a bee might just matter. You're in the stone halls of a medieval scriptorium. The air smells faintly of wax and damp vellum. Light filters in through a high, narrow window, tracing dust motes that float in a slow, sacred dance. You hear the distant scratching of a quill and the occasional cough-quiet markers of industrious silence. Kettle simmers, not with tea or stew, but with a thick, black concoction, the latest test in a centuries-long pursuit. Not for food, not for power, but for ink. Yes, ink. The kind you're likely not thinking about as you listen now. But for a small order of Benedictine monks in what is now southern Belgium, ink was no afterthought. It was sacred. And for over 2 centuries, they quietly obsessed over perfecting its formula. In a story that, while not filled with battles or betrayal, still speaks volumes about the patience and persistence that shaped human knowledge. Scriptorium by the forest, let us place ourselves around the year 1095. In a small monastic compound near the dense fog-bound Ardennes forest, the monastery of Sanctus Ardens was not large, perhaps 50 men at most. They were not rich. Their library was modest. They had one thing in abundance: patience. Those books were not simply read, they were born. Slowly, one letter at a time, by hands that trembled with age or diligence. Copying a single Bible might take years, and a smudged page could render a month's work moot. The monks of Sanctus Ardens had grown weary of these imperfections. Their ink faded too quickly. It smeared. It bled. And so, without ceremony or declaration, the monks began to tinker. In hidden rooms behind the chapel, they set up kettles and flasks. They boiled oak galls, stirred in iron salts, and experimented with soot, honey, egg white sieve urine. Because they were eccentric, but because chemistry, as they understood it, was still a sacred mystery. The head scribe at the time, Brother Arnaud, kept a notebook not of scripture, but of ratios. His entries were meticulous: 1 part gallnut to 2 parts iron filings. Result: legible but acidic. Adding vinegar caused feathering. Walnut husk. Gave a pleasant tone, but dried slowly, unfit for psalms. They did not know it then, but they were experimenting with early ferrogallic Inca substance that would become the standard, writing medium for centuries. But the monks weren't seeking standardization. They wanted perfection. Why ink mattered today, it might seem strange to imagine men devoting entire lives to ink, but to the scribes of the 12th century, ink was the vessel of eternity. It wasn't just pigment, it was permanence. They feared what the elements might do to their labor. Mold could rot vellum. The sun could bleach text into nothing. Dampness would blur whole pages into ghosts. So they adjusted. They began gathering oak galls not just from their forest, but from distant lands, strayed from passing pilgrims. Noticed galls from warmer climates were more potent. They experimented with the tannin content, unknowingly manipulating chemical reactions without the language to explain them. By 1142, under a new scribe named Brother Justus, the ink had darkened beautifully but left burn marks on the parchment over time. He suggested a binder made of milk. It helped for a while. Another scribe swore by using wine in the reduction. That batch smelt oddly festive but flaked after a year. Still, they documented each attempt. Page after page of dull trial and error. Their results were rarely dramatic, but they were steady. Influence without fame, there is no evidence the monks of Sanctus Ardens ever published their findings. Their inks were not sold, nor did they name them. But monks from other orders who visited began to notice something odd. The Ardentian manuscripts lasted. The ink didn't run. It didn't fade as others did. It clung to the vellum like conviction. A quiet reputation grew. In 1219, a visiting Cistercian monk named Frere Matthew stayed a week and copied several recipes in his own journal. That journal ended up in a larger monastic archive in Tours. From there, it may have made its way to Paris. Eventually, these obscure notes helped influence early European ink-making guilds in the 14th century. No one credited the monks of Sanctus Ardens, but in their forest monastery, they continued nonetheless, tweaking formulas, recording results, and often disagreeing over small things like the ideal drying time. A group of monks even debated whether the sound the ink made when stirred indicated purity of mixture. Brother Simon, a notoriously skeptical monk, once commented in his log, "Brother Petros insists that ink must smell of earth. I think it should smell of nothing. We may both be wrong. Time will tell." It's the science behind their silence historians. Looking back, have identified the ink formulas preserved in these Ardentian manuscripts as precursors to iron gall inke, the same ink used in many of the world's most important documents. From Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks to the U.S. Constitution, the Ardentian version used a slightly higher ratio of gall to iron, which gave it a richer tone and longer resistance to fading. But they couldn't have known this. But what they did know was far more human. Ink that didn't smear was easier to trust. Words that stayed in place meant knowledge could last longer. And for monks who believed eternity began with understanding, this small pursuit carried eternal weight. As the wind howled outside their cold stone scriptorium, the monks of Sanctus Ardens dipped their quills and trusted their ink. Centuries later, their anonymous lines still linger on faded parchment in museum basements and monastery shelves. But how did this obsession with permanence evolve into a broader movement? What happened when ink met bureaucracy, politics, and mass production? It's the early 1300s now, and a distant echo of those humble Benedictine experiments in the Ardennes forest is rippling quietly outward, like a slow-moving stream carving stone. The monks of Sanctus Ardens still labor in anonymity, but the ink they perfected, black, durable, slightly acidic, has begun to spread beyond their borders, passed along not by trade caravans or merchants, but by parchment. Manuscripts written in their hand have wandered to other abbeys, copied again and again. No one knows who wrote the originals, but everyone notices how well the writing holds. As Europe shifts from sleepy feudalism to increasingly structured governance, the demands for permanence of knowledge, of records, of power grow louder. Suddenly, ink is no longer just the concern of monks. Kings want it, bishops want it, and eventually lawyers will want it most of all. The bureaucratic boom. As kingdoms stabilized in the late medieval period, rulers needed records, land, grants, legal contracts, and taxation ledgers all had to be written. And written in ink that could not be washed away or disputed. For centuries, documents were sealed with wax to prevent tampering, but wax was fragile, and good ink was. Permanence in a bottle entered the chancelleries, the writing departments of royal courts. These were the new scriptoriums, staffed not by monks, but by professional scribe-trained men and occasionally women who spent their days drafting charters and edicts in tiny, cramped handwriting with deliberately ambiguous flourishes. Chancellors began requesting darker ink, more consistent ink, and more permanent ink. And what began as a spiritual pursuit for the monks became, quietly, the backbone of statecraft. By the mid-14th century, a document penned in rich, black ferroglic ink carried with it the authority of continuity. It looked important. It felt official. King's decree might be forgotten, but not if it were written in an ink that still shimmered centuries later. The rise of ink guilds, the invention of guilds, those medieval associations of craftsmen, soon brought ink into a more public domain. Cities like Bruges, Paris, and later Nuremberg, specialized ink makers began organizing under banners like stationers, scriveners, and artisans of letters. Some of them, knowingly or not, used recipes nearly identical to the Ardentian method, but they added their own flair coloring agents, perfumes, and sealants. Ink was becoming a product, and with it came secrets. Recipes were guarded fiercely. Apprentices were sworn to silence. Mistakes could ruin careers. A bad batch of ink, delivered to a royal scribe, might smudge a charter and cast doubt on a treaty. And so, slowly, what the monks had done in solitude, hundreds of quiet trials, Boiling pots and stone halls was industrialized and codified. There are documents from the 1380s that reveal urban ink makers charging extra for non-fading black. One Parisian stationer even offered eternal ink for a price so high. It was likely a luxury good, less about longevity and more about status. The irony: these merchants were probably using diluted Ardentian formulas, passed down by friars and scribes who never sought a coin. Forgotten monks, immortal words. Let's return to Sanctus Ardens now, in the mid-1400s. The monastery is aging. Its walls are mossy. Its population has shrunk. Many of the younger novices now choose more active orders. The library, once a humming hub of silent copying, is quieter than ever. But in the back room, yes, it's still there. Monk named Brother Leonhardt continues to stir kettles. He doesn't know that Gutenberg's press has already begun to roll in Mainz, that mass printing will soon make monks like him obsolete, that factories and standardized ink cartridges will flood the world with words printed, not penned. No, Brother Leonhardt only knows his ink. He believes, perhaps romantically, that one can still improve it. He writes in his ledger, "Today the gall was weaker. I steeped longer. Result, tolerable. This is not an ambitious note. It will not change the world. But it's the kind of note that built the foundation of our written record. That ink simple, quiet, durable will outlast even the presses. Ink and the law, as printing spreads in the 16th century, so does bureaucracy. And with bureaucracy comes litigation. Contracts, laws, and property disputes, all of them, require records. And once again, the humble ink becomes the cornerstone of trust. European courts begin requiring witness marks and specific ink types. Faded documents can no longer be accepted. In England, several lawsuits are recorded in which parties accuse each other of willful ink fading, charge implying intentional deception. It seems absurd now, but in a time before photocopies and digital backups, the clarity of the original ink was everything. Thus, Ferro-Gallic ink, perfected centuries earlier by monks seeking beauty and truth, becomes the ink of record for civil society, and not just in Europe. When colonists carry their laws to the New World, they carry their inks too. The U.S. Constitution was written in iron gall ink. So was the Declaration of Independence. Each bold stroke owes its permanence in a roundabout way to monks who never asked for recognition. When ink became invisible by the 1800s, chemical innovations begin to overtake traditional ink methods. Synthetic dyes offer brighter colors. Printing processes require faster drying mediums. The slow, kettle-boiled inks of the past are phased out. Yet remarkably, the ink made by the monks of Sanctus Ardens still lingers in old books, unread in libraries. The shimmer has faded, yes. The acidity may have eaten small holes through the parchment, but the words are there, still legible, still carrying the voice of long-dead scribes. The most curious part: we do not know any of their names. Number. Inventor is credited. No single monk gets fame. Only the collective survives. It's a small order of anonymous craftsmen whose pursuit of ink made knowledge more resilient. Their work, like their ink, was made to endure, not to be noticed. It's the 1700s now. The age of enlightenment is blooming across Europe. Coffee houses are filled with debates. Newspapers are spreading. Satirists are poking fun at kings. Everywhere there is writing, public, personal, political, and behind nearly every stroke is that same old formula: iron gall ink. It has come a long way from the mossy alcoves of Sanctus Ardens. Gone are the days when monks stirred batches slowly under candlelight. Now it is pharmacists, chemists, and literate revolutionaries buying ready-mixed jars. The ink is cheaper, more abundant, and more accessible. But curiously, its core ingredients have barely changed. Oak galls, ferrous sulfate, a binder. The spirit of the monastic recipe still pulses beneath every fiery pamphlet, every quietly scrawled diary entry. In a way, the monks got there. Wish. Their ink is everywhere. Ink in the age of revolution. Let's imagine a scene. 1776. A man sits at a wooden desk in Philadelphia, quill in hand. The document he's signing is dense with clauses and compromise, but it's radical. It will be remembered. His pen dips into a dark little inkwell, and he begins, when in the course of human events. That ink almost certainly iron gall, rich dark with a faint acidic smell. Across the ocean in France, another revolution brews. In Paris, petitions. And broadsides are nailed to church doors and tavern walls, which was penned or printed with ink, ink that stung the nose, ink that when freshly poured, shimmered with authority. It's poetic, in a way, substance born in silence and whispered. Prayers and careful alchemy becomes the carrier of public fury. Ink as art and intimacy, but not all writing was loud. The 18th and 19th centuries were also golden ages for letter writing, diary keeping, and sketching. Artists began using the permanence of iron gall ink to craft delicate drawings. Writers like Jane Austen and Emily Dickinson wrote their letters. And poems in it? Lovers exchanged notes on creamy stationery, the ink darkening as it dried, sealing secrets into the fibers of the page. Some of these letters survive today. The paper may have yellowed, but the ink often remains sharp, especially when stored away from light. In museums and archives, conservators examine these old writings with reverence. They know that without that ink, the voice would be lost. Sometimes, just sometimes, when the light hits the page just right, you can see the telltale rust-colored sheen of old iron gall. A quiet glimmer, as if the past is still trying to speak. The ink that bites back, but not all legacies are gentle. Iron gall ink, for all its durability, has a dark side. The very acidity that made it bind so well to parchment also made it hungry. Over time, improperly made ink can eat through paper, leaving brittle holes and ghostly outlines where text used to be. In the 1800s, this became a crisis for archivists. Legal documents, birth records, even Shakespeare's original. Manuscripts showed signs of ink burn, the paper cracked, writing flaked. What had seemed so permanent was quietly self-destructing. Governments scrambled. Ink formulas were reevaluated. In the early 20th century, many archives began deacidifying documents and storing them in climate-controlled vaults. Yet even with decay, the ink often held on. Strong iron gall, well-made, was stubborn. It clung to its letters. It refused to disappear. The scientific resurrection by the 21st century, the monks of Sanctus Ardennes, had been forgotten by history. Their monastery, likely dissolved in the chaos of the Reformation or simply abandoned to time, does not appear on any modern maps. But their ink, their ink still lingers. In laboratories and restoration workshops around the world, chemists and historians began reverse engineering the old formulas. Using chromatography and spectroscopy, they analyzed the residue left on medieval pages. They identified tannins from oak galls, iron compounds, and traces of gum arabic. Some even attempted to recreate it carefully, slowly boiling oak galls in distilled water. Watching the brew darken like ancient tea, what they found amazed them. The original recipe, when balanced just right, still outperformed many modern inks in durability. The monks, it turned out, had discovered something nearly perfect, not with machines, but with patience and prayer. The ink of intention, it's comforting in a way. In a world of ever faster communication, tweets, PDFs, disappearing messages, there remains something grounding about iron gall ink. Something slow, something quiet. It demanded time. You had to make it, stir it, wait for it to cool. You had to test it on a scrap, and then only then could you write. In doing so, you weren't just making marks, you were making a decision. To write something meant it mattered. To pour ink onto paper was to commit it to history. That's what the monks believed. Those words mattered. That truth required permanence. And so they gave us an ink that could carry whispers across centuries. The final page somewhere in a forgotten archive. Deep within the bindings of a 13th century psalter, the ink still glistens. The monk who wrote it never knew your name. He never knew this world would exist of laptops and lenses and live streams. But still, he wrote, he dipped his quill. He made his mark. He left no name, just ink. Long before email inboxes and postal, tracking apps, the British Royal Mail hummed with a quiet rhythm of envelopes and footsteps. Letters tied in bundles, parcels sealed with wax, telegraphs tapped out on brass keys. Every day, from tiny stone post offices in windswept Scottish villages to the thundering central sorting hubs in London, the mail moved with clockwork precision. But beneath the polished surfaces of wooden counters and brass postal scales, something less orderly stirred. Mice. Lots and lots of mice. Postal workers of Victorian England had a rodent problem. Not just the occasional scampering visitor, these were full-blown infestations. Mice chewed through mailbags, nibbled on stamps, nested in stacks of undelivered letters, and darted across sorting tables. They left tiny trails of droppings and mischief in their wake. And so, somewhere between the ink-stained hands and clattering carriage wheels, an unlikely hero emerged. Or, rather, purred. The first official postal cats. There's no single recorded day when the very first postal cat clocked in for duty. The practice seemed to have begun informally. A postmaster in an old stone office might have brought in his own mouser to deal with the problem. But by the 1860s, the practice had become widespread enough that the Royal Mail began to take notice and, eventually, to formalize it. Enter official postal cats. These were not just any cats. They were employees. They had names, were issued identification tags. In some cases, they were even given a salary, typically a weekly allowance of food, milk, and a small stipend. For care, and their job was simple, yet vital, keep the rodent population under control. A single cat could guard an entire mailroom. And guard it they did, with quiet, elegant determination. The life of a working cat life as a postal cat wasn't all naps and head scratches. Take Tibbs the Great, perhaps the most famous of all. Born in 1950, yes. The practice endured well into the 20th century. Tibbs was stationed at the post office. Headquarters in London, he weighed over 23 pounds. Prompt, proud, and utterly fearless. Tibbs kept the rodent population in check so effectively that he became something of a celebrity. He was featured in magazine articles, mentioned in internal memos, and praised in annual reports. But Tibbs wasn't the only cat on payroll. The 1870s records showed that the three main cats employed at the London Money Order Office collectively earned a salary of 1 shilling per week. The post office even budgeted for their upkeep because, as one supervisor noted, they earned their keep well. These cats wandered through pigeonholes, lounged atop letter-sorting tables, and napped. Between parcels, postal workers fed them regularly and often grew fond of their feline colleagues. Cat chaos and gentle rebellions, of course. Not every cat followed protocol. There are delightful anecdotes of postal cats wandering into restricted areas, knocking over ink bottles or curling up inside mailbags and refusing to move. One particularly headstrong tabby reportedly held up sorting operations by sprawling across the main ledger and hissing at anyone who dared disturb her. Another once made off with a carrier pigeon's message, perhaps a protest against avian encroachment on feline mail turf. Still, the cats were largely beloved. They gave post offices a sense of warmth and homeliness amidst the clatter of stamps and schedules. And they were unfailingly efficient at their primary duty. One report claimed a cat reduced mouse sightings in a large sorting facility by 80% in under a month. Not bad for a whiskered employee, placed in the postal machine by the late 19th century. The Royal Mail began issuing guidelines for postmasters on how to care for their feline staff. These included proper feeding, allowing sleeping areas and warm corners, and ensuring the cats were not disturbed by the constant comings and goings of human employees. Some offices even built little cat doors into their rear entrances, allowing their four-legged mousers to come and go as needed. It wasn't just about rodent control anymore. Postal cats had become part of the ecosystem, part of the rhythm of mail delivery. They were trusted, respected, and even occasionally mourned in official notices when they passed away. And when that happened, another cat was typically found to take their place. The mail, after all, must go on. In the long, murmuring corridors of Britain's General Post Office headquarters, a whiskered shadow once patrolled with quiet authority. He was not a clerk. He was not a messenger. He had no stamp book, no ink-stained fingertips. but everyone knew his name, Tibbs the Great. Tibbs was more than a cat. He was a Victorian institution. At over 23 pounds, that's right 23, he was the feline equivalent of a senior civil servant. He had his own food bowl, his own corner by the heating pipe, and his own unwritten understanding with the staff. Leave the mice to me. And so began the curious era of bureaucratic cat-keeping-ware employment records. Pay scales and departmental policies slowly wrapped themselves around a job once solved with a saucer of milk. The job description expands. At first, Tibbs was like any other postal cat. His duty was to keep mice away from the mail bags and money drawers. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Perhaps it was his size, or his photogenic poise, or the undeniable charisma of a tabby who never missed a target. Whatever it was, Tibbs began to attract attention. Newspaper reporters came to take pictures. Columns in the Evening Standard and the Daily Mirror referred to him as the official post office cat. He was featured in children's magazines. One editor jokingly described him as the most effective rodent control officer south of the Thames, and just like that, Tibbs became the poster cat, quite literally, for a tiny, whiskered workforce. He remained on the job for over 14 years. Paychecks and policies, the British postal system is famous for its precision, and it extended that fastidiousness to its feline staff. Official budget documents from the late 19th and early 20th centuries occasionally included small line items for cat maintenance. It wasn't extravagant, usually a few shillings per month for food and care, but it was formal. Accountants tallied it, postmasters submitted reports on it, and regional offices were expected to follow consistent guidelines. In 1912, a circular was distributed with recommendations on how often to feed cats, what types of meat or milk to provide, when a cat should be retired from service due to age procedures for acquiring a replacement cat. Imagine, for a moment, the stoic Victorian clerk's starched collar and quill pen-drafting policies about nap-friendly corners and which fish scraps were most appropriate for performance enhancement. It all sounds absurd. And yet there was a sort of gentle logic to it. Mice damaged letters. Letters carried money orders. Money orders were essential to commerce and wages. Therefore, cats who prevented that damage were vital cogs in the national economy, albeit purring ones. Public reaction. Amusement and admiration. Tibbs became something of a national treasure, but he was only the most famous among many. From York to Bristol, from Aberdeen to Southampton, tales of local postal cats were passed around with fondness. Some towns had tabbies, others had black or marmalade ones. Some were aloof and businesslike. Others reportedly cuddled with customers. Waiting in the queue, there were competitions, soft and informal, for the fattest cat or the most mice caught in a month. And when a particularly beloved postal cat died, it wasn't uncommon for the local newspaper to run a small obituary. Sometimes the postal staff held a quiet gathering in the break room. One such ceremony involved a small floral wreath and a farewell poem typed on an old Remington machine. There was something about contingent, quiet imperturbably, that fit beautifully within the rhythms of bureaucracy. They neither rushed nor panicked. They simply did what they did. And perhaps in an age of rapid industrial change, that was comforting. When the mail never slept, it's easy to forget, in our world of blinking email alerts and automated deliveries, just how tactile and organic the Victorian postal system was. There were smells, fresh ink, damp wool, and melting candle wax. There were sounds, the shuffle of envelopes, the hooves of delivery horses, and the click of scales weighing parcels. And there were cats weaving through all of it. Sometimes, they were the only warm bodies in a room during the pre-dawn hours. In cold sorting rooms and echoing marble foyers, they waited patiently as night shift workers scribbled in ledgers and prepared the next day's bundles. One account from 1897 describes a cat named Edith, who would ride on top of the mail cart as it traveled between the sorting depot and the train station. She would leap off the moment it stopped, race ahead to the next depot door, perched by the furnace until the workers caught up. To the workers, these cats weren't just mousers. They were mascots, companions, guardians of stillness in a world that was always rushing forward, pause of progress by the mid-20th century. As mechanical pest control improved and sorting systems modernized, the official use of postal cats began to decline, but the affection remained. Tibbs died in service. In 1964, the staff mourned him deeply. One clerk wrote in the newsletter, "He was part of the furniture, but the kind you miss when it's gone." No cat has since reached quite the same level of institutional fame. But in small ways, their legacy endures in stories told over teacups, in grainy, black-and-white photos and postal archives, and in the occasional statue or postcard tribute, and who knows? Somewhere in an old rural post office, a tabby might still be napping beside the radiator, dreaming of stamps and scraps, waiting for a mouse that never comes.
How long after the last mouse skittered across a Victorian post office?
Floor. Long after the last bowl of milk was placed quietly by the fire. Long after Tibbs the Great took his final nap near the sorting desk in London. The postal cats remain not in paw or fur, but in memory. In sepia-toned photographs, in scribbled ledgers and forgotten staff memos, in the margins of bureaucracy where whimsy and necessity once met, this final section traces the legacy left behind, not just in letters safely delivered, but in how these cats came to embody something softer, in a system built on structure, cataloged in carbon paper and ink. Archivists in the British Postal Museum, deep beneath Mount Pleasant's sorting office in London, still occasionally unearth curious notes. Most are mundane, shift schedules, route maps, and ink orders. But then, in the margins, someone will have doodled a paw print, or written, "Cat broke in again, chased 3 mice under desks, recommend we just keep her." Records mention food allowances. A scratched-out list of cat names to vote. Even the formal language sometimes slips, as of this month. We are down to 3 effective mousers, one sickly, and the other distracted by pigeons. Now, the charm isn't just in what was written, but in the fact that it was written at all, in a world where everything was logged from the weight of a telegram. To the hours worked by a mail cart driver, cats too were given their place. Not merely as animals, but as colleagues, albeit furry and silent. Victorian sentimentality meets government order. The Victorian era was paradoxical. It was obsessed with categorization, rules, and moral structure, and yet deeply sentimental. It was an age that built the world's most efficient postal network, but also wept over lost pets and wrote sonnets about canaries. Children's books like Gobelino, The Witch's Cat, and Orlando the Marmalade Cat sold by the millions, celebrating quiet feline dignity. And so, it's perhaps no surprise that the image of a cat calmly watching over a mountain of unsorted mail captured the public imagination. In fact, postcards were made featuring postal cats. Painted Christmas cards from the 1910s show cats wearing tiny red postman hats. A 1924 charity calendar included a full-page illustration titled "The Night." Shift supervisor, showing a portly tabby gazing out over sleeping clerks beside the glowing hearth. Cats became symbols not just of pest control, but of loyalty, a steadiness, silent watchfulness amid the hustle of letters, stamps, and steam trains. Threads in the tapestry of trust, there's a peculiar trust woven into the postal system. Every day, people hand over their secrets love letters, money orders, wills, small objects of sentiment, expect them to reach their destination safely. That trust is enforced by thousands of human hands. But cats added a quieter assurance that even in the smallest corners, the unlit basement, the overnight depot, someone was watching. A presence. A small guardian in fur. Children believed. In them. "Our letters are safe," a little boy once said in a letter to the Children's Post, "because Mr. Whisker sleeps on top of them." Postal cats didn't sign oaths. They didn't wear uniforms. But in their very being, calm, alert. Patient, they embodied the kind of watchfulness that reassured even the most skeptical clerk. A curious legacy, the cats are gone now. Most post offices no longer keep them. Their duties, like many others, have been replaced by technology. But they haven't been forgotten. At the British Postal Museum, a small display case holds an oil painting of Tibbs the Great. Alongside his food bowl and a set of photos from the 1950s, children visiting the museum often press their noses to the glass and ask, was he real? Yes, he was real. He ate beef scraps and cream. He walked the same marble corridors as the postmasters. He caught mice beneath the oak desks. And when he died, they mourned him with a quiet dignity rarely afforded to animals. Today, Tibbs is featured on commemorative stamps, and small local museums in places like Norwich and Exeter occasionally host displays titled The Postal Cats of England. A few volunteers still dress up in costume for reenactments. One retired. Postman brings his orange tabby named Geoffrey to school visits, letting children pet him as he tells stories of the Royal Whiskered Service. A final nap, so, if by chance, you should find yourself wandering through an old British village, and you step into a converted post office now turned tea room or antique shop, you see a cat curled in the window, purring softly. You might wonder if it's a coincidence or a descendant of those noble mice hunters who once guarded Britain's correspondents like silent sentinels. Maybe they remember. Maybe somewhere in their quiet feline minds they carry a memory of sacks of letters, of sorting clerks, of cold stone floors, warmed by the golden light of a gas lamp. Let them sleep.